Hello viewers, I am Dr. Purnima Khanna from Khalsa College of Law, Amritsar. In the present module, we will learn about the Regulating Act of 1773. My dear learners, the objectives of the present module are firstly, introduction, secondly, background of the Regulating Act 1773, reasons for passing of the Regulating Act 1773, significance of the Regulating Act, defects of the Regulating Act, and lastly, the conclusion. Dear learners, let's begin with brief overview of the topic. The Regulating Act in 1773, officially known as the East Indian Company Act 1772, was enacted by the British Parliament to alter the East India Company's governance in India. The Act was passed by the British Parliament to control the territories of the East India Company, majorly in Bengal. This Act was passed due to the misgovernment by the British East India Company that introduced a situation of bankruptcy, and the government had to interfere with the affairs of the company. Here, it is important to understand the background of the Regulating Act 1773. Well, after founding in 1600, the British East India Company began dealing with eastern countries. The corporation acquired political influence over Bengal, Bihar and Orissa after the Battle of Plassey of Buxar in 1764. But it never asserted its authority and retained Nawab as its nominee. The Nawab, however, failed to give clean administration. As a result, there was corruption, inefficiency and mismanagement all over the region. The servants of the East India Company took undue advantage of the situation and exploited their powers for selfish gains. The salaries of the East India Company servants in India were extremely low, but they earned huge profits by carrying on private trade and resorting to extortions and bribes. The general public in England was astonished by the colossal fortunes which these English people were bringing home from India. The public conscience was disturbed by the rumors of unscrupulous modes in which huge fortunes were amassed by English people in India. This was certainly on account of the company's mismanagement in India, which was making rapid strides towards bankruptcy. Due to the growth of frontiers and enormous expenditures in numerous battles, the company had been in financial trouble. The East India Company asked for a loan of £1 million from the British government in 1772. The government of Lord North took advantage of this situation to introduce alterations on a large scale into the system of governing Indian possessions of the company by passing the Regulating Act in 1773. The history of East India Company shows that whenever a chartered company acquired territorial sovereignty on an extensive scale, the British government assumed direct authority over its actions. Let's discuss the reasons for passing the Regulating Act 1773. The Regulating Act was passed by the British Parliament for establishing certain regulations for the better management of the affairs of the company in India. Thus, reasons for passing of the Regulating Act 1773 can be summed up as follows. Allegations of corruption and nepotism were rampant against company officials. There was a terrible famine in Bengal where a huge population perished. The dual form of administration instituted by Robert Clive was complex and drew a lot of complaints. According to this system, the company had Diwani rights obtained after the Battle of Buxar in Bengal, and the Nawab had Nizamat rights, judicial and policing rights, as secured from the Mughal emperor. In reality, both powers were vested with the East India Company. The farmers and the general population suffered as their improvement was neglected, and the company was only concerned with maximizing revenue. Lawlessness increased in Bengal. The defeat of the East India Company against Mysore's Hyder Ali in 1769. By 1773, the East India Company was in dire financial straits. The company was important to the British Empire because it was a monopoly trading company in India and the East, and many influential people were shareholders. The East India Company paid £40,000 annually to the government to maintain its monopoly, but had been unable to meet its commitments since 1768 because of the loss of tea sales to America. About 85% of all the tea in America was smuggled Dutch tea. The East India Company owed money to both the Bank of England and the government. It had £15 million of tea rotting in British warehouses and more en route from India. The Regulating Act 1773, complemented by the Tea Act 1773, had the principal objective of reducing the surplus of tea held by the financially troubled East India Company and improving its financial standing. Lord North overhauled the management of the India Company with the Regulating Act. The East India Company had taken over large areas of India for trading purposes and had an army to protect its interest. Company men were not trained to govern, so North's government began moves towards government control since India was of national importance. The Regulating Act 1773 set up a system whereby the British government supervised the work of the East India Company. Company shareholders opposed the act, and it was still a powerful lobbying group in Parliament despite its financial problems. Dear viewers, let's discuss the changes brought by the Regulating Act 1773. The main changes brought by the Regulating Act 1773 are as follows. Change in the constitution of the East India Company. The first measure taken under the Regulating Act 1773 was to change the constitution of the company. The method of the appointment and retirement of the directors of the East India Company in England with a view to tighten up the control over the affairs of the company in India. Hitherto, 24 directors were elected annually by the General Court of Shareholders of the company. But under the Regulating Act 1773, their tenure was to last for 4 years, and 1/4, that is 6 of them, were to retire every year by rotation. The voting power was restricted, and only those shareholders who had a stock of £1,000 were entitled to vote. Before the passing of the Act of 1773, the shareholders who had a stock of £500 were entitled to vote. These changes were intended to improve the quality of the General Court of Shareholders and to confer stability to the Board of Directors of the East India Company by raising their tenure from 1 year to 4 years. Then there was reorganization of the East India Company's government in Bengal. The Regulating Act 1773 introduced certain changes in the organization and powers of the government of presidency at Calcutta and Diwani provinces of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. After the Battle of Plassey, Calcutta was regarded as a British settlement and its sovereignty vested with the British Crown. As Professor M.P. Jain notes that the presidency of Calcutta was treated differently from the Mofussil areas because the Crown had de jure authority on the former and de facto on the latter. Mofussil areas were not formally annexed by the Crown, though the presidency of Calcutta was formally annexed by the Crown. As a matter of legal position, the inhabitants of Calcutta presidency were regarded as the subjects of the Crown, while the inhabitants of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa were considered to be the subjects of Nawab. Appointment of Governor General and 4 councillors. The Regulating Act 1773 provided for the appointment of a Governor General and 4 councillors for the government of Presidency of Calcutta. Powers and functions of Governor General and Council. The Governor General and Council was vested with the whole civil and military government of the Calcutta Presidency. The Council was empowered to regulate the management and government of all the territorial acquisitions and revenues in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. The Governor General in Council was bound by the majority decisions. The Governor General was given a casting vote in case the Council was equally divided on a certain issue. Thus, the majority in the Council could defeat the decision of the Governor General. What was the tenure of Governor General and Council? The Governor General and members of the Council were to be appointed for a period of 5 years, but they could be removed earlier by the British Crown on the recommendation of the Court of Directors. A casual vacancy in the office of the Governor General in Council was to be filled by the senior most member of the Council, and in case of the vacancy of councillors, it was to be filled by the East India Company with the consent of the British Crown. First Governor General of Bengal. The names of the first Governor General and 4 councillors were specified in the Act itself. The Regulating Act 1773 nominated Warren Hastings as the first Governor General of Bengal, and John Clavering, George Monson, Richard Beerwell and Phillips Francis as the first 4 councillors for 5 years, subject to their removal earlier by the Crown upon representation made by the Court of Directors in England. The powers of nominating and removing the succeeding Governor General in councillors was vested in the Court of Directors in England. As far as the superintendence over Governor General and Council is concerned, the Governor General and Council worked under the superintendence and control of the Court of Directors in England. The Council had to report regularly to the Court of Directors in England regarding all the matters relating to the government in presidency towns. Superintendence over Presidency of Madras and Bombay. The governments of these subordinate presidencies had to transmit regularly to the Governor General in Council regarding all the transactions and matters relating to the government, revenues and interests of the East India Company. The Governor General and Council was given the power of superintending and controlling the government and management of the presidencies of Madras and Bombay respectively in matters of war and peace, except in cases of special orders from England. Legislative authority. Prior to the enactment of Regulating Act 1773, the Governor General and Council of the Presidencies framed laws, but they could be effective only after the approval of the East India Company's Court of Directors in England. The Act authorized the Governor General and Council to make rules and regulations and issue ordinances for the good government of Presidency of Calcutta and the factories subordinate thereto. The rules, regulations and ordinances so framed were not to be repugnant to the laws of England. They were to be effective only after being published and registered with the Supreme Court of Judicature at Calcutta with its consent and approbation. Any person in India could file an appeal against such laws to the King in Council within 60 days of their registration in the Supreme Court. Likewise, any person in England could also appeal against them to the King in Council within 60 days of their publication in England. The King in Council, either at their own motion or on an appeal, could disapprove or disallow any of such laws within a period of 2 years from the date of their passage in India. The copies of the rules, regulations and ordinances were to be sent by the East India Company to the Secretary of State in England. There were two chief merits of the legislative scheme provided under the Regulating Act 1773. Firstly, it eliminated unnecessary delay involved in securing the consent of companies' directors in England. And secondly, it worked as an effective check on the hasty legislations passed by the Governor General in Council. Prohibition on carrying private trade and accepting gifts. The Act made it illegal for East India Company servants to engage in any personal commerce or accept gifts or bribery from natives. Section 23 of the Regulating Act 1773 provided that the Governor General, members of the Council, judges of the Supreme Court were prohibited from accepting presents and rewards from Indians. No person holding any civil or military office under the British Crown or the East India Company could accept any gift or reward from any of the Indian princes. They were also prohibited from engaging themselves in the private trade. Section 39 of the Regulating Act provided that the offences, crimes and misdemeanours committed by the Governor General, members of the Council, governors of presidencies of Bombay and Madras, any judge of the Supreme Court against any of His Majesty's subjects or any inhabitant of India could be tried and punished by the Court of King in Council in England. Then next is establishment of Supreme Court of Judicature at Calcutta. With enactment of the Regulating Act 1773, the provisions of the earlier Charter of 1753 were superseded, and the Act of 1773 empowered the Crown to establish a Supreme Court at Fort William. The British King George III issued a charter on March 26, 1774, which established a Supreme Court at Calcutta. It was a Crown's court. The court of request were, however, allowed to continue. The Governor General, members of the Council and the judges of the Supreme Court were appointed as Justice of Peace and were empowered to hold quarter session for administering criminal justice. Sir Elia MP was appointed as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at Fort Williams at Calcutta. Significance of the Regulating Act 1773. The Regulating Act 1773 introduced significant changes in the constitution and functioning of the East India Company's executive government in India and restructuring the judicial administration in the territories of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa by establishing a Supreme Court of Judicature at Calcutta. The Supreme Court at Calcutta, which included the Governor General and 4 members of the Council, was made the central executive authority with the power of civil and military government within the British possessions in India, including the presidencies of Madras and Bombay. My dear viewers, let us discuss the drawbacks of the Regulating Act 1773. Despite noble intentions of the framers of the Regulating Act to work out a comprehensive scheme of good government for British India, the Act suffered from certain obscurities and defects, which led to constant tussle between the Supreme Court and Governor General and Council. The powers of the Supreme Court were not clearly defined. It also led to considerable infighting between the Governor General and the members of his council. It allowed for the Governor to have a council of individuals nominated either by the British government, with the council making the rest of the decisions and the Governor General having just a deciding vote. As a consequence, the British government could exert control over the East India Company's operations in India. The Regulating Act 1773 did not address the Indian population who were paying taxes and revenue and could not mitigate corruption amongst the officials of the company. To eliminate the drawbacks of the Regulating Act of 1773, an Amendment Act was passed in 1781. It illustrated the relationship between the Supreme Court and the Governor General. It was also called the Declaratory Act of 1771. My dear learners, on the basis of foregoing discussion, it may be summed up that in India's history, the Regulating Act of 1773 is very significant. For the first time in India, a new constitution for business governance was adopted by this statute. This act marked the commencement of British legislative oversight of the company's regime in India. As a consequence, the management of the company's ruled territories was no longer a private thing for the company's traders. The act was the first step taken by the British government to regulate and control the East India Company's affairs in India. The main purpose of the Regulating Act was to stay abreast of the firm's businesses in India and Britain and to fix any deficiencies that had previously existed. It prohibited the servants of the company from engaging in any private trade or accepting presents or bribes from the natives. The Act elevated Governor of Bengal Warren Hastings to Governor General of Bengal and subsumed the presidencies of Madras and Bombay under Bengal's control. The company directors were elected for a period of 5 years and 1/4 of them were to retire every year. Also, they could not be re-elected. The company directors were directed to make public all correspondence on revenue, civil and military matters with Indian authorities before the British authorities. It laid the foundation for the centralized administration in India. Governor of Bengal became the Governor General of Bengal with an executive council of 4 to assist him. Decisions would be taken by majority and the Governor General could only vote in case of a tie. A Supreme Court was established at Fort William at Calcutta. British judges were to be sent to India to administer the British legal system that was used there. It has permitted the company to keep back its territorial possession in India. It had not given complete power to the company, hence it was called as Regulating Act. However, the Regulating Act 1773 did not address the concerns of the Indian population who were paying revenue to the company. It did not stop corruption among the company officials. The Supreme Court's powers were not well defined. The parliamentary control that was sought in the activities of the company proved to be ineffective, as there was no mechanism to study the reports sent by the Governor General in Council. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Thank you very much.